Hey everyone, welcome back to our Bible study. Today we're talking about Psalm 95, and if you listen closely, you might learn more than just Psalm 95 today. You might learn some Albanian words, and that's because the downstairs of the building next to me, there's like 6 or 7 construction workers standing around. I'm not exactly sure what they're doing, but talking very loudly for sure. Not much I can do about that, so you might hear them in the background, so forgive the background noise. But speaking of, let's talk about Psalm 95. You can download this PDF on our website for free if you would like it. You'll notice that there's not like an introduction section, that preface section that gives us the author in most Psalms here. So the author of Psalm 95 is once again unknown. We do have some New Testament references in Hebrews specifically. Hebrews chapter 3, verses 7 through 11 and verse 15. And then Hebrews 4, verse 3, 5, and 7. So you might want to go check those out after the study's over. For themes today, there's an invitation to worship the Lord, and then following that up, there's a warning about or against hardening your heart towards God. We do have one word that needs to be defined at, well, technically two, in verse 8, and these are actually names of a place. Massa and Meribah, they're going to be mentioned in verse 8, and these were places where... Let's see if I can do this in between the sawing. When the Israelites were in the wilderness, there was a place that they were at where they grumbled against God and against Moses because they didn't have any water. That place became known as Massa and Meribah. Jumping over to page number 2, let's take a look at our first section. It's verses 1 through the first part of verse 7, an invitation to worship the Lord. So the psalm is an invitation for God's people, the people of Israel and Judah, to worship God. And the psalmist says that there's several reasons that God deserves to be worshipped. Number 1, God is a great king who's greater than all other gods, all the idols of the foreign nations. Number 2, the whole earth was created by him and is in his control. And number 3, he's a good shepherd who cares for his sheep or his people. All right, now section number 2, verses 7, the second half of verse 7 through the end of the chapter, verse 11. Do not harden your hearts. So after inviting people to worship, the psalmist now gives a warning. He warns these people not to harden their hearts against God as some of their forefathers had done. Many years previous to this, when the Israelites were traveling out of Egypt and they were going to Canaan or the Promised Land, they camped in a place that didn't have any water. And rather than expressing faith that God was going to take care of them, they started grumbling and complaining against God and against Moses because they didn't have any water. And so you can read about that in Exodus chapter 17, verse 1 through 6. God ended up miraculously providing the people with water by having Moses strike a rock with his staff. But the place became known by this name, Meribah and Massa, because of the unfaithfulness that God's people showed when they were there. If I wasn't talking about a psalm that condemned complaining, I might be complaining right now. God spoke of that generation of Israelites very harshly. He says, "For 40 years I loathed that generation," in verse 10. The psalmist didn't want the people of his generation to make the same mistakes that their ancestors had made. And so rather than having them, sit around complaining, he invites them to do something better, which is to meditate on the greatness of God and to worship. Okay, now let's go down and finish up with our application for today. If you are only focused on your immediate circumstances, and that's all that you can set your mind on, you're very likely to miss the work that God is doing in your life. God did not bring the Israelites out of Egypt with 10 miraculous plagues just to let them die in the wilderness because they didn't have any water. It was rather foolish for the Israelites to think that, but their sole focus on their immediate unpleasant circumstances led them into that irrational conclusion. What they needed to do was to zoom out, to take a wider view, and realize that God had a plan for them, and He had promised them that. They also needed to realize that God was testing them and maturing them in that moment. The text actually tells us that. It's easy to serve God when things are comfortable, but will a person abandon their faith when life gets hard? If we can't take that wider perspective when the circumstances of our life get hard, then we're going to end up falling into the same sins as the Israelites. We're going to start grumbling and complaining and asking whether God really knows what He's doing, and we're going to lose our trust in Him. When your life gets hard, step back, remind yourself of God's promises, Widen your perspective and ask what God might be doing through this difficult season of your life. Remind yourself that you don't want to be faithful just when things are easy. So ask God for wisdom and then resolve in yourself to pass the test that's in front of you with unwavering faith.